Imagine yourself waking in a wooden cabin on the edge of the American frontier. The morning air is still cool, carrying the faint scent of pine, smoke, and freshly turned earth. Outside, the first rays of sunlight spread across the open prairie, touching the log walls of a small general store. Today, we step quietly into the life of the man who runs it, a frontier storekeeper whose daily rhythm blends hard work with simple hospitality. Let us begin our journey as the morning slowly unfolds. The first light of dawn filters through the cracks in the shutters, pulling the storekeeper from sleep before the rooster crows. His bed is little more than a straw mattress stretched across a wooden frame, covered with a woolen quilt that holds the warmth of the night. For a moment, he lies still, listening to the gentle creak of the cabin timbers and the soft rustle of the breeze outside. Beyond the thin walls, the frontier is waking. Horses stamp in the corral, impatient for feed. A cow lowing in the distance reminds him that his neighbors, too, are stirring from slumber. Somewhere down the dirt track, smoke rises from a chimney, curling lazily into the pale morning sky. The day has only just begun, yet it already carries the promise of steady work and quiet encounters. The storekeeper pushes himself from bed, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and pulls on his work clothes. A simple cotton shirt, homespun trousers, and sturdy leather boots worn from years of use. A vest, patched in places, adds a bit of warmth against the lingering chill. He lights a tallow candle to guide his steps and crosses into the main room of his dwelling, which is joined to the general store by a narrow doorway. His wife has already set water to boil over the small iron stove, and the smell of coffee begins to drift through the air. The aroma is sharp and comforting, one of the few luxuries they allow themselves. On the table rests a modest breakfast: cornbread baked the night before, a small crock of apple preserves, and a bit of salted pork. Before he sits, however, the storekeeper steps outside. The frontier morning greets him with its cool breath and its wide silence. The landscape stretches endlessly before him, a patchwork of fields, prairie grass, and thick woodland edging the horizon. The dirt road that runs past his store is still empty, but he knows it won't stay that way for long. Farmers, trappers, and weary travelers will soon pass through, looking to trade, buy supplies, or simply share a word of news from beyond the settlement. He pauses, leaning against the wooden rail of the porch, and takes in the sound of the world around him. Birds call from the trees, the rhythmic tap of a woodpecker echoing faintly in the distance. The sun, now rising higher, bathes the landscape in soft gold. The morning carries a sense of stillness, as though the land itself is holding its breath before the day begins in earnest. Returning inside, the storekeeper takes his breakfast slowly, savoring each bite. He knows once the store opens, the hours will slip by in a blur of activity, measuring flour, weighing sugar, cutting cloth, and bartering goods. For now, he lets himself enjoy the quiet company of his family, the warmth of the coffee cup in his hand, and the knowledge that his work, though demanding, is the heart of the community. When the last crumbs are brushed away, he pushes back from the table and heads to the store. The room smells faintly of pine boards and the mingled scents of its contents: dried tobacco, spices, lamp oil, leather, and freshly milled grain. Wooden shelves line the walls, carefully stacked with goods both common and rare. Glass jars filled with hard candy sit beside sacks of beans, while bolts of calico fabric rest near hand-forged nails and tin kettles. The storekeeper moves deliberately through the space, checking that everything is in its place. He brushes dust from the counter, polishes the brass scale, and sweeps the plank floor. The small bell above the door glints faintly in the morning light, ready to announce the first customer of the day. He finds comfort in these rituals, in the quiet order that prepares him for the rush of neighbors and travelers who will soon appear. Outside, the village stirs further to life. A wagon rattles past, wheels crunching against the packed earth. Children laugh as they chase a stray dog down the lane. A farmer calls out to his oxen, urging them into the fields. These sounds mingle with the faint jingle of bridles and the murmur of voices, familiar notes in the symphony of frontier life. The storekeeper pauses once more by the doorway, hands resting on the frame, and allows himself to feel the rhythm of the morning. He knows that before the day is done, he will hear stories of hardship and triumph, of distant towns and far-off lands. He will see the faces of neighbors he has known for years, and strangers passing through with little more than the clothes on their backs. His store is not merely a place of trade, but a gathering point, a crossroads of community. As the sun rises higher and the shadows shorten, the storekeeper takes a final deep breath of the cool morning air, then turns back inside. He lifts the latch, flips the wooden sign to "Open," and waits in the calm stillness of expectation. Soon enough, the day's work will begin in earnest. For now, in these gentle hours of the frontier morning, there is peace and there is purpose. The sun had barely climbed above the horizon when the first figures began to appear along the dusty track that passed for a main road in this little frontier settlement. The general store, with its wide wooden porch and hand-painted sign, was often the first place people stopped once the day's work began. It was more than a shop. It was a lifeline, a place where neighbors met, traded, shared news, and found what they needed to keep their households and farms running. The store owner, having already swept the porch and set out a few barrels of apples and dried beans, stood by the counter as the door creaked open. The faint sound of spurs on wooden planks gave away the first customer of the morning, a cattle rancher from the edge of town. His boots were worn, his hat pulled low, and he carried the dust of the prairie on his coat. He tipped his head politely, then set down a list scribbled on a folded scrap of paper. Need flour, molasses, and a length of rope. He said, his voice gravelly from the morning air. The storekeeper nodded, moving with steady ease through the shelves. Flour in a sturdy sack, molasses in a glass jar sealed tight with wax, and rope wound neatly into a coil, all placed on the counter with practiced hands. Payment was not always in coins. Sometimes it was cattle, sometimes eggs, sometimes even labor. In this case, the rancher pulled a small leather pouch from his coat and placed several silver coins down. As the transaction finished, a new sound rose from outside, the laughter of children and the clip-clop of a mule's hooves. A young woman entered with two small boys clinging to her skirt. She was the wife of a homesteader whose farm sat a few miles beyond the settlement. Her face carried the tired look of someone who worked from dawn to dusk. Yet her smile was warm as she greeted the store owner. "We'll need sugar today, and some needles if you have them," she said, glancing around the shelves, stacked with tins, jars, and bolts of cloth. The children, wide-eyed, looked at the jars of candy behind the counter. Peppermints and licorice were rare treats, and the storekeeper often set one aside for children when their parents made a purchase. Reaching into the glass jar, he placed 2 striped candies into their small hands. Their faces lit up, and the mother gave a grateful nod. These little acts of kindness build trust, turning customers into loyal friends who returned week after week. By mid-morning, the store was lively with voices. A trapper arrived trading furs for lamp oil and coffee. A group of farmers came in together, discussing the weather and the possibility of early frost, their words blending into a hum of conversation. The storekeeper moved between them, weighing out nails on the iron scale, cutting sections of cloth with a pair of heavy shears, and recording sales in a leather-bound ledger. It was not always about goods. The general store was also a hub of information. News from neighboring towns, rumors of railroad expansions, and letters delivered by post riders often passed through its walls. Customers lingered not only to shop, but to hear the latest word from beyond the horizon. At one point, a traveling salesman stopped by. His wagon outside was loaded with shiny tinware and patent medicines. He asked if the storekeeper might purchase some stock. The storekeeper, cautious, examined the goods carefully. Frontier folk depended on items that could last, and flimsy tin pots or questionable tonics were often left unsold. After a polite exchange, he agreed to buy only a handful of items, testing the quality before offering them to his regulars. The store grew busier as the hours passed, the air filled with the mingled smells of spices, leather, and sawdust. The sound of the cash drawer opening and closing, the shuffle of boots on the plank floor, and the creak of the door swinging open became a rhythm as natural as the ticking of a clock. Each customer brought a different story: a farmer saving to buy seed for spring, a widow needing candles for the coming winter nights, a miner searching for sturdy gloves. Though the work was constant, there was a quiet satisfaction in meeting these needs. The general store stood at the center of daily life, where every transaction carried weight. The goods on the shelves were not luxuries but essentials that kept families fed, warm, and safe. Each item handed over the counter was more than a purchase. It was a small step in the survival and growth of the community. As the noon hour approached, the flow of customers slowed. Many returned to their farms or workshops, and the street outside quieted. The storekeeper took a moment to wipe the counter and glance around the room. Empty spaces on the shelves reminded him that a new shipment would be due within the week, brought in by wagon from the nearest larger town. Until then, careful management was key. The first wave of customers had come and gone, leaving behind not just coins and bartered goods, but stories, laughter, and the shared sense of belonging that bound the settlement together. For the storekeeper, it was a reminder that the work was not just about selling supplies. It was about being part of the fabric of frontier life, where every customer was also a neighbor, and every morning brought a new chance to strengthen the ties that held the community steady in uncertain times. The rhythm of the day in a frontier general store was never entirely predictable. While coins and paper money did make their way through the door, more often than not, business was conducted in the old-fashioned way, through trade and barter. The creak of the wooden door would announce a visitor, sometimes a farmer with strong hands, soil still clinging to his boots. He might bring with him a basket of fresh eggs, neatly arranged, their shells mottled in soft browns and creams. He would place them gently on the counter, his eyes shifting toward a roll of salt pork hanging from the rafter, or perhaps a small sack of coffee beans. The store owner, practiced in such exchanges, would run his fingers over the eggs, feeling their weight, checking for cracks. Then, with a slow nod, he would calculate what seemed fair. A pound of pork for a dozen eggs, perhaps with a pinch of sugar added to sweeten the deal. Both parties would leave with something needed, and neither, with a faint rustle of paper money. At times, bartering felt like an art, a dance between two people who knew the value of their goods. A trapper might appear, his arms carrying furs still soft with winter thickness. Beaver pelts, fox skins, or even a prized otter hide would be laid across the counter. These were worth more, often traded for larger staples, flour, kerosene, or a spool of bright thread his wife had requested. The weight of the pelt in the owner's hands would tell a story, how well it had been cured, whether the fur was of fine quality. Not all trades were equal, and sometimes gentle negotiation was required. A farmer might linger, turning his hat in his hands, asking if 2 jars of homemade preserves could really fetch him the tin of nails he needed. The store owner, seeing both the man's earnestness and the scarcity of nails, might bend the balance a little, knowing that goodwill was worth more than a coin in the long run. After all, on the frontier, reputation traveled faster than wagons on the road. The store owner, who was thought of as fair, honest, and generous when times were lean, would find customers returning, even if competition arrived someday. Children often came in clutching small items, eager to learn the ways of trade. A boy might proudly bring in a handful of freshly caught fish, glistening and cold, in hopes of exchanging them for a packet of peppermint candy. His eyes would widen with joy when the deal was struck. The sweet reward wrapped in brown paper and placed into his hands. The store was not just a place of commerce, it was a school in fairness, in value, and in the bonds that knit a community together. Even those with little to spare found ways to exchange what they had. A seamstress might bring in mended shirts or homespun cloth, hoping to swap for kerosene to keep her lamp burning through the long evenings. Sometimes, barter wasn't just about goods, but services. A neighbor might offer to mend a broken chair in exchange for a tin of coffee, or sharpen a set of tools for a small measure of molasses. Every exchange carried with it more than a transfer of goods. It carried trust. Each handshake, each nod, each quiet word spoken across the wooden counter reminded the community that they relied on one another. Money might be scarce, but ingenuity and fairness kept life moving forward. By mid-afternoon, the counter would often be cluttered with baskets, jars, bundles of cloth, and the occasional still damp pelt. The air filled with a patchwork of smells: earthy potatoes, the sweet tang of fruit preserves, the faint musk of leather and fur. The storekeeper would keep a careful ledger, not always of coins, but of debts and trades, written in neat lines of ink to ensure fairness. As the bartering slowed and the goods were arranged on shelves or tucked away for safekeeping, the store seemed to hum with life. It was not a grand marketplace, but in its own way, it was the beating heart of the settlement, a place where value was measured not just in dollars, but in trust, fairness, and the shared survival of the frontier. The day wears on, and as the sun climbs high over the rolling hills of the frontier, the general store slowly transforms from a quiet place of trade into something much more. It becomes the very center of the settlement's social life. By the afternoon, the wooden porch out front is no longer just a shaded resting spot for weary travelers, but a stage where conversations, laughter, and news flow as freely as the wind across the plains. The general store, with its wide front steps and squeaky swinging door, offers a welcoming sight for anyone walking down the dusty main road. For some, the stop is practical, a chance to purchase a few pounds of flour, a tin of lamp oil, or a new length of cloth. For others, it is a social call, a moment to linger with neighbors they may not see for days or weeks otherwise. In frontier life, where isolation was common, the store provided a rare chance to come together. Outside, a group of farmers gathers by the hitching posts. Their boots coated in dust, their hats tipped against the sun. They lean casually against the railings, speaking about the weather, always an important subject when crops and livestock depend on it. One man might mention a good rain that blessed his field, while another shares his worry about an approaching dry spell. Their words are plain, yet their tone carries the weight of survival. Still, there is a certain comfort in knowing that others are enduring the same struggles. Nearby, children laugh and play in the yard, chasing each other around barrels and crates stacked outside. Their giggles ring out, mingling with the brain of a tethered mule and the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer. For these youngsters, the general store is more than a marketplace. It is a playground, a place of endless fascination where penny candy, bright marbles, and tin whistles sit waiting on low shelves inside. Inside the store, the hum of voices grows louder. The wooden floorboards creak beneath the steady shuffle of boots, while the counter becomes a natural gathering spot. A few men sit on overturned barrels, playing a slow game of checkers with pieces that have been worn smooth by countless hands. Others crowd near the stove, even in warmer months, out of habit, telling stories and sharing news from nearby towns. The general store owner listens with half an ear, smiling as he tallies accounts in his ledger. He knows that his store is more than a place of business. It is the heart of the community where friendships are forged and strengthened. He greets each newcomer warmly, offering a word of encouragement or a quick joke to lighten the mood. On the shelves, goods seem to carry more than their practical value. A bolt of fabric might become the dress a young woman will wear to church, while a tin of nails could mean the difference between a cabin standing strong or falling into disrepair. Yet these items are part of a larger rhythm of life, one that binds the people together in shared need and shared hope. As the afternoon deepens, conversations drift to local events. A preacher mentions his plans for Sunday's sermon. A mother discusses the quilting bee she is hosting next week. Someone recalls a traveling fiddler who passed through town, and soon a lively debate begins about whether he was truly the best fiddler anyone had heard. These discussions, though simple, create a tapestry of community life that stretches beyond the store's walls. From time to time, the door creaks open, letting in a draft of warm air along with another neighbor. Each arrival is marked by greetings, handshakes, and nods. News travels quickly in such a place. If someone has fallen ill, others ask after them. If a family has welcomed a new baby, congratulations echo around the room. In this way, the store serves as the settlement's unofficial newspaper, a place where all are kept in the know. The store also becomes a stage for small kindnesses. A farmer who has brought in extra apples shares them freely with those who have none. A woman with a knack for baking leaves behind a loaf of bread for a family going through hard times. These gestures may seem small, but on the frontier they can mean everything. As the sun lowers and its golden light pours through the wide windows, the gathering takes on a warm, almost timeless quality. The store glows softly, filled with the quiet comfort of people who find strength in one another's company. The storekeeper leans against the counter, watching it all unfold with quiet pride. He knows that tomorrow will bring new challenges, new tasks, and new struggles. But for now, in this shared moment, the community feels whole, steady, and strong. In these gatherings, the general store is not merely a business. It is a hearth without a fire, a church without pews, a home without walls. It is the lifeblood of the frontier town, a place where stories are told, friendships are nurtured, and life, with all its difficulties, feels a little lighter. And so, as the evening shadows lengthen, the general store remains bright with laughter and voices, a beacon of belonging in the wide and often lonely world of the frontier. As the sun crept higher over the dusty rooftops of the small frontier town, the rhythm of the day inside the general store began to shift. The bustling chatter of neighbors had given way to quieter conversations, and the sound of boots scuffing across the worn wooden floor grew less frequent. Customers were still coming and going, of course, but in the gentle lull between the morning rush and the busy afternoon, the storekeeper found a chance to sit at his desk with the ledger. The ledger was the heart of the store. Bound in rough leather, with its pages softened from years of turning, it carried the record of every sack of flour sold, every spool of thread traded, every axe handle marked down in careful script. For a store owner, this book was not just numbers and lists, it was a story of the community itself. The general store served as more than a shop. It was also a bank, a credit office, and sometimes a last resort when times were hard. Few families paid with coins alone. Money was scarce in frontier settlements, and neighbors often relied on credit, trading, or promises written down on the page. The ledger recorded debts that might stretch for months, even years, until the next harvest or the next cattle drive brought a chance to settle accounts. The storekeeper dipped his quill into a small bottle of ink, steadying his hand as he marked the columns with slow, deliberate strokes. Names filled the pages. The Johnson family, who owed for flour and salt, young Samuel Miller, whose father had left him to trade firewood for tools, and Mrs. Atkins, who had paid for cloth with a basket of eggs, the exchange carefully noted in the margins. Each entry carried with it a memory. The storekeeper could recall the worried look on a farmer's face when the corn harvest had failed, or the grateful smile of a mother whose children were fed thanks to a few pounds of sugar carried home on credit. The ledger was full of such stories, written not in long sentences, but in columns of figures and lines of ink. Balancing the accounts was a quiet task, but also one that required patience and fairness. The storekeeper knew the worth of trust, and he treated each neighbor's debt with care. To demand payment too quickly might leave a family hungry. To wait too long might place the store itself in danger. A delicate balance was always at play, and the ledger was the instrument that kept it steady. Outside, the wind carried the sound of horses down the road, but inside, the only sound was the faint scratching of the quill across paper. Occasionally, the storekeeper paused, rubbing his fingers over the ink stains that marked his hand, and looked around the shop. The shelves were partly bare, where sacks of grain had been sold earlier, but there was still barrels of beans, jars of molasses, and bolts of cloth waiting for buyers. All of it, he knew, had to be accounted for. Inventory was as important as credit. The storekeeper kept lists of goods, arriving from wagons that rattled over long dirt roads, and he made careful notes of what was sold and what remained. A barrel of nails, for instance, might sit for weeks before being emptied by the blacksmith. A cask of coffee beans might be gone in only a few days, for no one in the town liked to begin a morning without a steaming cup. Numbers filled the pages, but they were never cold or lifeless. Each figure represented the lifeblood of the settlement. Every mark told of a family's labor, a farmer's sweat, or a craftsman's skill. The ledger reminded the storekeeper that he was part of something larger than his own shop. His work tied him to every household for miles around, binding their fortunes together with ink and paper. Now and then, a customer stepped through the doorway while he worked. A neighbor might stop to ask about their balance or to offer a few coins toward an old debt. Sometimes a child carried. In a note from their parents, promising to pay after the harvest. Each of these visits was noted carefully in the margins, with the same steady hand and quiet respect. As the afternoon sun slanted through the window, the ledger pages glowed faintly golden in the light. The storekeeper turned another leaf, smoothing it flat with his palm. The book was thick with years of careful keeping, and he thought of how many stories lay hidden in its columns. It was not just a record of debts and credits, it was a record of survival, of trust, and of community. Closing the ledger at last, the storekeeper rested his hand on its cover. The accounts were balanced for now, the goods recorded, the debts remembered. Tomorrow would bring new figures, new names, new stories. But for this quiet afternoon, there was a sense of peace in the steady order of ink and page. The hum of life outside the door went on, but here, in the stillness of the store, the ledger kept it silent. Watch, guarding the shared history of a frontier town. The soft hum of the frontier town often changed when the supply wagons were due. For a general store owner, this day was both one of anticipation and quiet labor. The creak of wagon wheels on the uneven dirt road carried through the air long before the wagons came into sight. It was a sound that promised new goods, restocked shelves, and a chance to fulfill the needs of the community. The morning light stretched across the store's wooden porch as the owner leaned against the railing, eyes fixed on the horizon. Dust rose in the distance, stirred up by the steady rhythm of hooves. The journey from larger trading towns was long, often taking weeks, and each delivery carried the mark of that distance. Weather-worn crates, barrels sealed tightly against moisture, and canvas coverings that bore the stains of mud and rain. When the wagons finally pulled up, the moment was almost ceremonial. Horses exhaled heavy breaths, their sides damp with sweat, while drivers tipped their hats and exchanged a word of greeting. Neighbors sometimes gathered just to watch the arrival, for the supply run was not only a practical necessity but also a thread that connected the small settlement to the wider world beyond its borders. The unloading began with care. Barrels of flour and sugar were rolled gently down makeshift planks. Wooden crates were pried open with the dull scrape of iron crowbars. Within them were treasures both simple and rare. Bolts of cloth in muted blues and earthy reds, tins of coffee and tea, boxes of nails and tools, and occasionally a small indulgence, a jar of molasses, a packet of cinnamon, or a crate of glass lanterns that glittered faintly in the light. Each item carried a weight of expectation. Families, who had been waiting for weeks, would soon come to collect what they had requested, whether it was a spool of thread, a bar of soap, or a length of rope for farm work. For the storekeeper, There was a satisfaction in knowing that every crate held pieces of daily life, things that made survival not only possible, but more comfortable. Children often lingered around the wagons, their eyes wide at the sight of candies wrapped in paper or small wooden toys tucked away in corners of shipments. They whispered to one another with excitement, knowing that a rare treat might find its way into their hands if a parent was in generous spirits that week. The process of restocking the shelves was slow and deliberate. The storekeeper, sometimes with the help of neighbors or hired hands, carried sacks of flour onto sturdy wooden shelves, stacked tins of lard neatly in rows, and unwrapped fragile glassware with gentle precision. The store transformed with each delivery, its shelves once again full, its air filled with the faint mingling scents of soap, tobacco, and dried spices. There was also the important matter of record keeping. Deliveries were never free. Every item came with its cost, carefully noted in the ledger. The storekeeper took time to balance accounts with the wagon drivers, marking which debts were settled and which would be carried forward until the next visit. It was a task that required honesty and fairness, for trust was the backbone of commerce in the frontier. As the wagons emptied, the drivers often shared stories of the road, the weather they had endured, the swollen rivers they had forded, or the travelers they had encountered along the way. Sometimes they brought news of distant towns, a fair being held, a new family moving west, or whispers of changing prices for wheat and livestock. These stories were almost as valuable as the goods themselves, for they reminded the small settlement that it was part of something larger, part of a country still shaping itself. By afternoon, the once busy scene grew quieter. The wagons, now lighter, rolled away to continue their routes, leaving behind a store freshly stocked and ready for the week ahead. For the owner, there was a moment of pause, an exhale of gratitude for supplies safely delivered, and shelves once again brimming with possibility. Evening fell gently, and the glow of lamplight inside the store revealed neat rows of goods, each one waiting for the touch of a customer's hand. The day of deliveries, though tiring, was a reminder of the fragile but enduring connection between the frontier town and the world beyond its borders. Without these wagons, life here would be far harder. With them, there was always the promise of renewal, of needs met, and of small joys discovered among the crates and barrels. And so, the storekeeper closed the shutters that night with a quiet satisfaction, knowing that tomorrow, when the townsfolk came through the door, they would find what they had been waiting for. There is a certain quiet excitement that drifts through the general store when whispers of a special order make their way into conversation. Unlike the usual goods, barrels of flour, bolts of cloth, or jars of molasses, special orders have a touch of wonder about them. They are rare items, things that hint at distant lands or the comforts of a life left behind in the East. They carry with them a sense of anticipation, both for the customer who waits and for the shopkeeper who has carefully arranged their arrival. The store's counter, worn smooth by years of transactions, becomes a stage for these moments. The shopkeeper pulls out a wooden crate, still smelling faintly of pine, the slats nailed shut to protect whatever treasure lies within. A small group of customers often gathers, curious about what might be inside. Sometimes it is as simple as a replacement tool ordered months prior, an iron kettle, or a saw blade. Other times it is a box filled with books, their bindings fine and pages crisp, the scent of ink and paper stirring something familiar in those who have gone long without such luxuries. On one occasion, A farmer's wife might have saved for months to purchase a small piano, sent all the way from the East Coast. Its journey across muddy roads and rattling wagons is nearly a story in itself. And the day it arrives, the air in the store hums with admiration. Children crowd near, their eyes wide as the lid is carefully lifted to reveal polished wood gleaming in the sunlight. In that moment, the store feels less like a frontier outpost and more like a link to the grand world beyond. Even the simpler goods, fine tea leaves wrapped in paper packets, porcelain cups, or exotic spices, carry with them an aura of luxury. To sip tea with a hint of cinnamon or nutmeg is to taste something of another continent, a reminder that the frontier, though isolated, is never entirely cut off. The storekeeper, in his quiet role, is the bridge between rugged survival and a hint of refinement. Often, these special orders are planned months in advance. Families write down what they hope to obtain, tallying costs carefully against what they can trade or spare in coin. They wait patiently, sometimes through long winters, knowing that a wagon will one day roll into town, carrying a crate with their name written across it. And when it arrives, the anticipation is rewarded. There is a small ceremony in opening it, whether it contains a pair of spectacles, a delicate clock, or simply a stack of letters from faraway kin. But it is not just material goods that find their way in. The store sometimes receives rare newspapers, carrying news from cities hundreds of miles away. Folks lean in close to read, the rustling of the pages almost reverent, as if each line is a thin rope connecting them to the larger world. A story of a political debate, a scientific discovery, or even just the weather in Boston feels extraordinary when read aloud in a frontier store surrounded by prairie and silence. The special orders remind the townsfolk of what is possible, that even in a place where hardships are common, there are still glimpses of beauty, comfort, and connection. A porcelain teacup on a wooden table, a rare book by the fireside, or a carefully wound pocket watch ticking softly. All of these things speak to continuity, to the life that stretches beyond the dust of the frontier. For the storekeeper, there is quiet pride in facilitating these moments. He understands the gravity of handing over an item that has traveled so far. He watches the way eyes soften, how hands linger on smooth surfaces, how voices lower with gratitude. It is not simply a transaction, it is an exchange of hope, memory, and belonging. And so, the store remains a place of both necessity and wonder. Ordinary goods line the shelves, but here and there, tucked away or proudly displayed, are those rare treasures. They are reminders that the frontier is not only about survival, but also about holding on to beauty, curiosity, and the possibility of a richer life. As the golden light of late afternoon stretches longer across the wooden floorboards, the pace of the store begins to slow. The sharp bustle of the day softens into something gentler. By now, most of the chores have been done. The shelves are straightened, the ledger balanced, and the day's trades tucked neatly into memory. Outside, the sun lowers beyond the tree line, painting the sky with muted streaks of amber, rose, and pale violet. The cicadas begin their steady evening hum, a sound that seems to drift in through every crack and crevice of the old wooden building. The store, which had been lively with footsteps, voices, and laughter earlier, now holds a quieter rhythm. A few late customers may still wander in, someone looking for a bit of lamp oil, another in need of flour or nails for the next day's work. But their visits feel unhurried, almost contemplative. In the softening light, voices naturally lower, and the conversations carry the peaceful tone of people wrapping up their day. The storekeeper knows these hours well. They are a time for winding down, for taking stock not only of goods, but of the simple blessings of a steady day's work. A chair by the front counter often serves as a resting place, allowing the keeper to watch the shadows grow longer across the wooden porch outside. Every so often, a rider may pass along the dusty road, their silhouette briefly framed against the sinking sun. Candles and oil lamps are lit, one by one, as the daylight fades. Their glow adds warmth to the shelves, sending little flickers across jars, bottles, and tins. The soft light transforms the store, making it feel less like a place of trade and more like a homestead. Shadows dance gently across the walls, and the familiar smell of kerosene blends with the faint scents of wood, dried herbs, and old paper. Children, if they come in with their parents at this hour, are quieter too. Instead of running between shelves, they might rest their heads on counters or tug sleepily at their mother's skirt. The evening has a way of slowing everyone down, reminding them that the day has nearly run its course. Sometimes, neighbors will linger just a little longer, leaning on the counter as they share the last stories of the day. These conversations feel different from those in the morning. They are softer, perhaps more reflective, filled with mentions of tomorrow's tasks or a hope for fair weather. In the calm of the evening, time feels unhurried, as though the world itself has taken a long breath. When the final customer departs and the bell above the door makes its last faint jingle, the storekeeper closes the shutters. The outside world grows darker, the calls of night birds replacing the sounds of wagons and voices on the road. Inside, the oil lamps cast their steady light, creating a pocket of warmth against the night. The cash drawer is counted, the day's coins set aside neatly, and the counter wiped down one final time. There is comfort in these rituals, the closing of shutters, the dousing of one lamp, then another, the creak of wooden steps as the storekeeper makes a last walk through the aisles. Each shelf, now quiet, seems to rest along with the keeper. By the time the last lamp is extinguished, the store falls into a hushed stillness, broken only by the faint hum of insects outside. For the storekeeper, this is not just the end of a business day, but the gentle close of another chapter in the long rhythm of frontier life. Tomorrow, the doors will open again. The shelves will be touched by hands seeking both the ordinary and the unexpected, and the cycle will begin anew. But for now, in this moment, the store is simply a quiet refuge, at peace with the night. As the sun slipped low in the sky, the small frontier store began to take on a different kind of atmosphere. The long, busy day of trade was drawing to a close. Where the morning had been filled with the shuffle of boots on wooden floors, the calls of neighbors greeting each other, and the steady exchange of goods and coins, now there was a slower rhythm. The lamps were lit, their warm glow casting gentle circles of light across shelves and counters, while the rest of the shop eased into stillness. The storekeeper moved about quietly, putting away stray items left out during the day. A bolt of cloth was rolled up and tied neatly with twine. The small jars of sweets that had been so popular with the children were returned to their shelf behind the counter. A half-empty barrel of dried beans was covered with its wooden lid. These small rituals of tidying were part of the routine, a way of bringing order back after the bustle of commerce. Outside, the sounds of the settlement softened as well. A few wagons still rattled along the dirt road, heading back to farms and cabins, Chickens clucked as they settled into their coops for the night. The faint smell of wood smoke drifted in from chimneys where families were preparing their evening meals. The frontier, though rugged and demanding, carried with it a kind of peace when the day's work was done. Inside the store, the ledger was closed for the evening, its careful columns of ink waiting for tomorrow's entries. The storekeeper often paused at this moment, running a hand across the worn wooden cover of the book, reflecting on the transactions recorded there. Each line was more than just numbers. It represented a neighbor's needs met, a family's hard work exchanged for something useful, or a traveler's brief stop along their journey. The store was not merely a business. It was a place where lives intersected. As twilight deepened, the family began to gather in the living quarters. At the back of the store, most frontier storekeepers lived above or behind their shop, keeping them close to both their livelihood and their community. Children's laughter floated through as they finished small chores or settled with simple toys carved from wood. The scent of supper filled the air, often a stew of vegetables, beans, and whatever meat might be available that day. Bread, baked earlier, was brought out, its crust still carrying a faint warmth. At the table, conversation flowed in a gentle rhythm. Stories of the day's customers were shared. Mrs. Harris bringing in fresh butter to trade, young Samuel Thompson proudly purchasing nails to help his father mend the barn, or the group of travelers passing through on their way west. These accounts were more than idle talk. They were a record of the life of the community woven together around the supper table. After the meal, there was time for quieter reflection. Sometimes, the storekeeper would sit by the fire with a well-worn Bible or a cherished family letter. Other times, there might be the soft hum of a tune, the gentle strum of a fiddle, or the shared reading of a storybook, if one was available. Life was hard, and luxuries were few, but these simple comforts were deeply treasured. The children often drifted to sleep early, worn out from their own small labors or play. Parents tucked them into bed, their faces lit softly by candlelight. For the adults, there was still time to talk a little longer about the hopes for the next harvest, the possibility of new settlers arriving, or the quiet worries that came with life on the edge of the frontier. Yet, even in these conversations, there was a sense of endurance, of facing each challenge together. Closing the day in this way brought a certain peace. The store, now dark and silent, stood as a quiet sentinel at the heart of the settlement. Tomorrow it would once again be filled with voices, footsteps, and exchanges, but tonight it rested, just as the family and the town around it did. In the hush of evening, with the lamps extinguished and the stars spreading across the wide sky, the frontier store became more than just a place of business. It was a symbol of connection between neighbors, between families, and between the past and the future. And in those closing moments of reflection and family time, it held within it the steady, enduring spirit of frontier life. The first pale light of morning crept gently across the wooden shutters, seeping into the quiet cabin. The world outside was hushed, still wrapped in the delicate silence of dawn. Only the faint chorus of birds beginning their song hinted that a new day was arriving on the frontier. Inside, the shopkeeper stirred slowly. The fire had burned low in the hearth, its embers glowing faintly, like little stars caught in ash. He rose from his bed with the steady rhythm of habit, his body well accustomed to the early hours. Around him, his family still slept peacefully, bundled in quilts against the cool morning air. The shopkeeper dressed quietly, careful not to disturb the gentle breathing of his wife and children. He pulled on his boots, worn but sturdy, and reached for his coat. Before stepping outside, he paused at the threshold of the cabin and breathed in deeply. The air carried the scent of dew on grass, mixed with faint wood smoke lingering from the night's fires. The frontier morning had a stillness that no city could hold. The land stretched wide and open, each day beginning like a blank page waiting to be written upon. He walked toward the store, his boots crunching softly on the damp earth. The sky above him was streaked with hues of pink and orange, a painter's touch across the horizon. The outline of the little shop stood quietly against the lightening sky, its familiar silhouette a reminder of both labor and purpose. Inside, he lit a lantern, even though the dawn light was beginning to filter in through the windows. He moved with care, unlocking the doors, lifting the shutters, and preparing the shop for the life it would hold throughout the day. Each gesture was slow and deliberate, as though he were part of an old ritual that tied him not only to his own livelihood, but to the community itself. He straightened the shelves, counted coins in the till, and checked the flour barrels. The work was simple, but it carried weight. This store was more than a place of goods. It was a lifeline for neighbors who would arrive with stories, needs, and hopes for the day ahead. The shopkeeper often thought about this balance of giving and receiving. His work was not just in selling, it was in listening, in offering a place where weary travelers could pause, where a farmer might trade news, and where a mother might find the small things needed to keep her household steady. As the morning deepened, the quiet of the frontier stirred into motion. A wagon rattled down the distant dirt road, the sound of an axe split wood somewhere beyond the tree line. A rooster crowed with insistence, announcing the day's beginning in a way that felt older than memory. The shopkeeper stepped outside and leaned against the doorway for a moment, letting the sunlight warm his face. He thought of the many mornings that had passed much like this one. Simple, steady, unchanging, and yet there was always something new to notice. A shift in the color of the leaves, a fresher breeze from the west, or the way the light fell differently across the land. Each dawn carried the quiet promise of possibility. When his family finally joined him, the day was already unfolding. His wife arrived with a basket of bread she had baked, placing loaves neatly on the counter for sale. His children came shortly after, eyes bright with sleep, still clinging to them, their laughter filling the shop with warmth. The little store became alive again, as it always did, bridging the stillness of the morning with the pulse of daily life. Neighbors arrived, exchanging greetings and coin. Goods moved across the counter, sacks of grain, bolts of cloth, jars of molasses. Each transaction felt like a thread woven into the fabric of community. The shopkeeper smiled quietly at it all, knowing that what he built here was not measured only in coins or in shelves of goods, but in trust, in connection, and in the rhythm of shared life. By late morning, the sun had risen fully, spilling gold across the wooden porch and the road that stretched out before the shop. The horizon seemed endless, as though the land itself breathed with possibility. For the shopkeeper, this was the heart of frontier life, a steady balance of work and hope, of challenges faced and small joys savored. Each dawn reminded him that no matter how difficult a day might be, another would follow, carrying with it a chance to begin again. And so, as he stood in the doorway of his store on that new morning, he felt a calmness settle within him. Life on the frontier was never easy, but it was real, honest, and full of meaning. The sun rose higher, warming the land, and the day stretched open before him. With a quiet nod to himself, he returned to his work, ready to meet whatever stories and needs the day would bring. Another dawn had arrived, and with it, the timeless rhythm of life on the frontier continued. Steady, enduring, and full of quiet grace.